Um, so yeah, this is the first slide. If everyone wants to take a stab at this question, let me know what you think. I'll give you like 30 seconds. Just unmute yourself and put your answer in the chat. Prize for the first person to get it right. Oh, I need to play the Kahoot music in the background while I do this.
Yeah, what's the prize, Krishi? I need some incentive for this kind of thing. I'm just kidding.
Oh shoot, I stopped sharing. It's free plane ticket to Japan.
Limit of 1,600 USD.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I got chat box popping off. Okay, Matt.
I'm not sure if I'm right. I'm just
the answer.
Okay. All right.
No, you're right, man. Great work. So yeah, the answer is B, and this is one of the harder but typical questions you'd see on an IQ test, like a spatial thinking oriented type of question. So I just want to talk a little bit about the shortcomings of and alternatives to intelligence quotient. And the timeline is we talk about the history, give you guys a poll, talk about some benefits, alternatives, and hopefully give you time to create your own sorts of question. Or this is what I would ask the Japanese students to do, is to design their own questions, either after at the end of the camp, because I was thinking of alternatives to a presentation as a deliverable. And I thought it would be cool to have them try to design their own sort of psychometric scale to try to evaluate people's something, whether it be character, creativity, cultural competency, depending on what interests them. And of course, you can't really do justice to such a broad topic in a weekend time frame, but I think would be a really interesting, good place to start. Also, I'm not going to talk this fast. Audience was Japanese students, so starting with a brief history, there was this French psychologist named Alfred Binet, and he created the progenitor to the IQ scale that we know today. But he also noted in some of his writings that it was not a comprehensive measure of intelligence, and he said that intelligence is also, it doesn't take account of creativity or social or behavioral skills. The U.S. Army then implemented it in World War II, and depending on what IQ score you got, that would help funnel you into different departments of the war, whether it be like a pilot or behind the scenes kind of worker. So it had a lot of ramifications into what you could be, your occupation. And interestingly, there's another case study how the police force in the US mandated a maximum IQ because they were afraid that people who scored beyond the threshold of IQ would become bored with their job later on and would not yield to the tedium of everyday police forcing. So this is just some history that happened in the early 1900s. This is Alfred Binet, the French psychologist. Here comes the dark history of IQ. There is an American psychometrician named Carl Brigham, and he made the claim in the 1920s or so that American IQ was in the decline because of high rates of immigration and integration. And this other scientist named Terman justified racial segregation and white supremacy through the intelligence quotients, and said that if the reason that people score less on the IQ scales is because of racial or ethnic differences. So this became a way to corroborate racism and eugenics and ethnocentrism through the lens of science, quote unquote. And there was a Supreme Court ruling in 1927 called Buck v. Bell, and it legalized the forced sterilization of people of color, poor people, and people with disabilities. So it has a dark history, and it's, well, I'll talk about how it has changed, but that's something we have to keep in mind, and something we should recognize as the limitations of the intelligence quotient and using it to justify other practices and policy. So this is like a picture of a forced sterilization. Okay, yeah, I don't know if you guys want to do the poll or. Well, the poll I was going to ask is just like, how can we, or how is the scientific defense of IQ refuted? So does anyone have any suggestions? We don't actually have to do the poll, but how do you think, what are some shortcomings that other psychologists and sociologists pointed out to IQ that helped create an academic framework to push back against racist policy. Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. I kind of mentioned it earlier. Intelligence is highly variable, both culturally and temporally. Can anyone think of any examples of this? So like, yeah, anyone?
Oh,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say a good example of intelligence being like culturally variable is like there's some education systems that value memorization more, and some education systems that value more like spontaneous coming up with answers. So depending on which school system you're in, you could either be seen as like really smart or really not smart, depending on like which one of those you're better at.
Yeah, 100%. And the next slide is actually a map that points right to that, Sophie, so thank you. And I think like this one is especially important to mention for Japanese students because of its notorious cutthroat culture in education and rather, emphasis on one specific type of intelligence and definition of success. It's changing and whatnot, but the fact that they have their own vocabulary for salaryman and karoshi, which is death by overwork, is, I think, good reason to try to expand the student's perspective on what can be considered intelligent and successful in the future. So yeah, Sophie brought up a great example. Some other examples could be slurping your noodles in Japan is a form of cultural competency that indicates respect. Like Hadza tribe in Tanzania have a lot of intelligence about medicinal herbs that occur, but this isn't necessarily recognized by Western culture. Some good news is that sterilization victims were compensated by the US government in the early 21st century, and it was ruled unconstitutional to execute prisoners with low IQs in 2002. But the question remains if we can even use IQ still today because of its dark past. So, this all funnels into standardized testing, and if this is the right metric, like SAT, ACT, I'm sure Japanese students will have a lot of questions about those as they're applying to colleges. So yeah, it's a little map to consider how diverse our definitions of intelligence can be. All that said, there are still some benefits to IQ scales. They help identify gifted children, but the problems to this can be that they neglect minorities or children of color who are quote unquote not gifted because of different reasons or systemic changes. But at the same time, these very IQ scales can identify those structural inequalities that have affected the child's development. For example, if they had lead contamination in their water, malnutrition, or lack of healthcare access, that could have contributed to poorer development and needs to be something that is changed. Universal screening also helps identify kids who would be otherwise unnoticed. And the IQ scale is really helpful in determining if progress has been made in some specific scientific studies like treatments for ADHD, addiction, or depression. So there are some redeeming factors to IQ. And if anyone wants to take a riddle at the middle of the screen, if you've been reading that, anyone want to answer that?
Your left hand?
Dalton on fire. Matt, okay. Was that Dalton? Okay. Yeah, that's right.
I'll take credit.
It's not right, it's left. Thanks, Matt. So all that said, at this point, I would encourage the students to try to think of alternatives to IQ. And I haven't created a timeline like the Friday, Saturday, Sunday thing, but maybe one day they could just spend the whole time researching. And if they propose an idea or a scale they're really interested in that's alternative, then they could run it by a intern, and we could help them create questions that are akin to that scale. So quote, social and behavior skills are far better predictors of success than cognitive skills, which is true. It's been shown by psychology and sociology research. That's one thing to keep in mind. So if you score like a 10 out of 10 on your multiplication test all throughout elementary school, it does not really indicate at all how successful you're going to be in the future. Ties very well with Dalton's presentation, I think, with business skills and interpersonal relationships. So one example of fraternal skill is the emotional quotient, EQ, how well you can understand, and I don't want to say manipulate, but manipulate with a positive connotation, work with other people's emotions, because that is at the crux of social skills. So this is an example of the kind of question that you would see if two of your friends are fighting. I'd probably pick B, or the second option. Just joking. Try to pick the first one. So the next one is a creativity test. It's called a Torrance test. Obviously, there are a lot of different examples. So this is an example of one type, and you start out with certain shapes, and the participants are asked to create whatever they can make out of those shapes and using only those shapes. So for example, you start with a circle here, if you can see my mouse, and then you go to make a Mickey Mouse out of just circles. Less creative would be chain. But one concession I must make with creativity and emotional quotient scales is that they're a lot harder to quantify because they're not numerically quantified. So it'd be like an ordinal rather than cardinal measuring. So that's a problem we have to keep in mind. And because who's to say that a chain is any less creative than Mickey Mouse? And again, social skill, it overlaps with emotional quotient, but just how you work with other people and your interpersonal skills. Some example questions. Again, this is really hard to quantify because it's not numerically done. It's just a Likert scale. This is a really popular scale called the Raven Matrices test, and it's really similar to IQ. And if we have time, if anyone wants to try to answer this too, this one's probably the hardest of the three that I've shown so far.
I think I got all someone can figure it out. Oh man.
Something in the chat. Kelly put G. That's correct. All right, well done. Basically, the way you do this is you focus on each shape individually. So if you look at the triangle, it's like ascending, boom, boom, and then boom, boom. And then you know it's going to be at the bottom right because it's like following this pattern. This rhombus stays on the right side of its relative square, just shifting up and down. So you know it's going to be in the bottom right over here. And the hexagon is just basically tracing the perimeter of the square. So you got to follow that. And then you end up with G. So obviously these are just samples of hundreds and thousands of different intelligence, creativity, cultural scales out there. And I would just encourage the students at this point to do some research of their own and see if any sort of scales caught their attention and focus some of their investigation on it and come up with their own scale and use that as their deliverable. But to keep in mind things like cultural considerations, to look beyond logic and be creative. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Krishi. Awesome. And I know when was that? That was a few months ago when we had that great conversation.